Welcome. At the moment, Jerry Stier is giving information about Atlantis. So if you'll bear with us and enjoy the presentation of the slideshow that he's going to bring to you in just a moment. Thank you.
67 has been basically drawn from many sources. Unfortunately, there is no existing photographs of Atlantis in the present day, although strangely enough, and we may touch a little bit on it, there are some artifacts that you could make a pretty good case for were contemporary with different periods of Atlantis, and surprisingly enough, not necessarily just the very last age. Again, it's conjectural, and this is where to do serious Atlantean research. Psychic and the sensitive that can tune in. The problem is, and I'm sure the question may well be raised, is that, well, one psychic says this, and this psychic says this, and never shall the twain meet. This can be rather noticeable if you compare, let's say, the work of Edgar Cayce and the theosophical work of Madame Blavatsky. And yet, again, if we can stretch our minds and our imaginations a little bit this evening and realize we're talking about a time frame of at least 200,000 years, if Cayce's correct, we'll begin to see within that vast time period there is room for everyone. And there's also on the inner planes the realms of if. Many people, when they leave the body and perhaps out of a life of frustration, said, well, if only things could have been different. Or what if such and such didn't happen in Atlantis, but so and so happened. Well, then you can see that unfold in reality, in color, or what have you, on some of these inner planes. So it wouldn't be surprising if you came back in embodiment and perhaps you were regressed, you would have an element of Atlantis that perhaps no one else would see, but it would have reality to you on the soul and spiritual level. So I just wanted to give you a little introduction here. Some things might surprise you and not seem very Atlantean. I can only say there was an overlapping. There was a great soul host in the beginning, and they were in earlier ages before Atlantis. Atlantis is sort of late in the day, in this 200,000 year period. So anyway, if you stretch your imagination and look with an inner eye as well as the outer, you might recognize some times and places where you have been before. Okay. Lynn Rogers was, excuse me, I am fighting off a cold a little bit, so if my voice stretches a little bit, bear with me. But Lynn wanted me to talk a little bit about the creation story. And as we interpret Cayce, why there was a great spiritual rebellion in the inner planes before the worlds were. It's a little hard for us to imagine, but if we think in terms of spirit and the unfoldment of the Father, Mother, God, there were individualizing souls, all created in the beginning, but with embryonic consciousnesses that were becoming more and more individualized. A great group soul might be called the Luciferian consciousness, not in a negative sense, as we put it far later, but far more symbolically visual. Might be a painting like this, outlined in stars. If any of you seen some of the Gilbert Williams visionary paintings, the ethereal beings, this might illustrate something of the tremendous pride and the intensity of spirit that brought them out of the higher harmonies of heaven and into the worlds of form and, of course, the world of cause and effect. This, in a sense, might represent chaos in expression, colorful and bright, not anything of evil per se. They were as cosmic children, but expressing with cosmic power, God power that we can't imagine in our tiny fragmented state today. But a part of this expression of consciousness, or fall, if you will, from higher spiritual spectrums down into the lower, more dense realms of matter. All of you can recognize, of course, the yin-yang symbology here, because everything, both in the spiritual and the outer realms, does link with the masculine and feminine principle. I rather suspect this is much too crude a statement when you really get to the refinement of spirit. But there is this duality of opposites. There is also, as you move into the realm of cause and effect, or matter, the influence of the other planetary and solar bodies, the influence of geometry, as we find in the Cayce philosophy section in There's a River. And I'm sure all of you are very knowledgeable about Edgar Cayce, and I highly recommend the philosophy section in There's a River. But its numbers, the harmonies of these various aspects. Whoops. I'm going backwards, sorry about that. Good to know, though. Sometimes we find ourselves going backward on the trail of life. But don't lose hope, whatever things look like in the world today. We are getting better and coming much further than in the ages before. Here might be a representative of the Earth and its moon, the Earth being the mother, as it were, of the moon, and slowly being drawn out. But this wasn't a happenstance, chancy thing, as your orthodox scientists would have you believe. This was all controlled and directed by the power of these spiritual beings, these cosmic children, creating with a scale and an ability that we can't imagine at this point in time. But they were shaping these worlds, these stars, these energies within the body of a larger consciousness. One may call it another dimension, another ultra realm. But all of this has conscious intelligence. And if any of you are interested in studying the angel, sorry about that, and the devas, then you begin to realize how the elementals are working for us non-stop at all times. We've got an elemental in here that's ready at my beck and call. We have one over here. We have it in our car engines, our toasters, our radio. They're constantly the unseen, invisible forces that are working. Well, these are intelligences of different level, that the spiritual hierarchy, again in the beginning, they were directed by these cosmic children who were shaping and building their world. And they built the planets almost as centers, from the center outward. And in doing so, they compressed the spiritual light, you could call it the white light, the spark of God light within this creation, within each atom, within each molecule, and compressed it with their self-willed creations. And finally, as time went on in a realm where we perhaps didn't have what we could call time, we had a sphere called Earth. It was undoubtedly a revelation for those that still clung very stubbornly to the idea that the Earth was flat, to see some of these NASA photographs. But I don't think we have any active flatliners or flatlanders in the world today. And we see that we indeed live on a beautiful globe. If we go back to the beginnings of the formation of the planet, of course it looked quite different. There wasn't the water on it. It was as barren in a sense as the moon itself, because you have to project this was a playground for these cosmic children. In a sense, this picture is a little bit allegorical. It's symbolic of perhaps the realm of the Father, Mother, God, and this great love, but having given these cosmic children free will, they have to find themselves. They have to unfold their own spiritual divinity. And you can't be cosmic children, as it were, and not explore and adventure outward. And you parents know it's not the easiest things to get the kids to listen to sage advice. They got to do their own thing. But this is emblematical, if you will, of this descent into consciousness. And again, shaping their world, what would be even cultures or the archetypes for cultures, through the stars, astrological influences, on many levels. I dare say that we in our outer realm have no idea of inner dimensions of very pivotal influences that are a factor. This might illustrate the desire form. It's like a thought, and yet it's desire. It's physical, it's feeling, it's sensual. And ultimately, when expressed in flesh, it becomes sensual and sexual. And you have all of these combinations. You have the red of the masculine principle. You have the green of the feminine principle. You have the power of thought. And all of these building as clusters. If we look at any object in our everyday world, we've learned enough through science and study that we know we're not seeing in truth what we think we're seeing. This looks like a lamp perhaps, but actually it's space with myriad atoms rotating, revolving. And is there anything smaller within the infinitude of the atom? It goes on literally without end. But matter is composed of these particles and forms, and they are built, as Cayce said so many times, line upon line, thought upon thought. Now we start getting to some of the rather fascinating, if a little bit horrifying aspects of some of the early cycles of the Earth. All of the creatures and bogeymen that we find in horror films and fantasy, we could find a like pattern at some time in the Earth's involution. At this point, spirit was binding itself in consciousness and form, going within. And in part, this is what helped to shape the crust of the Earth. The Gillman is one of the more popular creatures, but you might have had a whole cycle where other of these celestial beings saw these creations. Hey, that looks interesting, but you don't have it quite right. Let me give a little spin on it, you know. And you get a little competition going, and first thing you know, you've created variations on the theme. Grotesque, because you see they were creating out of selfishness, not out of evil. But these were like games, almost though children playing with blocks. And so, oh yeah, these creatures we make are more interesting if they move and they scuttle and just don't lay there like a lump. You know? And if we give them emotions and feelings, wow, we really got something going. Conflict and excitement. But there was no love because they were not expressing through the medium of love. They were expressing through desire. Not hate, but ignorance. They hadn't developed empathy or compassion. Now, here's an example of, some of you can recognize Africa and Madagascar over here to our left, and parts of India up there toward the upper center, and we see a little bit of Australia and the East Indies. Of course, we're looking at an ocean floor here. But it dramatically illustrates how the Earth has changed over the ages. Lands once above the water, and Cayce is very emphatic about this, that at the end of great cycles submerge and go deep within the sea. The fracture zones, the crustal alignments, the shifting of the Earth on itself, creating such incredibly massive tensions on the crystallized aspects of matter that we see great splits. We'd be staggered at some of these things were we to see them on the surface of the Earth. But they abound under the seas, and they represent past cycles of consciousness. I always like this drawing, and of course, if you're interested in these subjects, you sort of look around, hey, where can I find a picture that might illustrate a concept? It becomes very subjective. And that's why each person could do their own Atlantis story or Lemurian story, and it might be quite different, even though we might be working from the same basic text, because it is a subjective feeling thing. Your reality might not be my reality. Although I suspect, since we're all sitting in this room, why we've all bumped elbows more than a few times over the ages. But this represents to me a little bit of the beginning of light dawning in the Lemurian cycle. You can get a sense of great crystallization of consciousness in these towering spires. And if you look closely, I think you see that the land masses are actually human beings in flesh. Somebody else might think of it as a hellish thing. But remember, these cosmic children had to learn. And that's why they were given free will. They had their own playground, they shaped it, and they formed it, and they built it, and they played with all the creatures, but they had yet to define or unfold the divine within them, spiritually speaking. Now, the Lemurian cycle reached a very low point. You could equate it with the fire of volcanic eruptions, the crystallization of matter itself, the limitation of thought. These beings, the more they moved in consciousness away from the Father, Mother, God, the more closed down they became. And this might represent one of the spiritual low points of Lemuria. This might be one of the lords of the dark face. And this is a point, actually, the darkest before the light. I think you can find in the Cayce readings, this is an example of the spiritual leader, let's say, that first moved out of matter. He was the morning star, beginning to become aware of what had occurred and how they had limited themselves in their consciousness and their forms, and determined to make amends for this and to do better than they did before. And so you had a beginning of an awareness of looking around. So what have we made for ourselves? Are we in a snake pit of desires, of negativity, so to the point where we can no longer remember the Father, Mother, God, and where we've been? And with this first releasing, let's say, a little of their ego and pride, there could come spiritual illumination, an awareness of the duality of the masculine, feminine principles, and a greater force, and the very fact that they themselves were not in a very desirable point. But this, I'm speaking on one level of archetypally, on another level, this became expressed in physical form in the cycles that came after this low point of Lemuria. If you're familiar with Conan and Frank Frazetta's work, this is a classic example of doing the creation of Lemurian memories, imaginations, and experiences. Edgar Rice Burroughs' Tarzan had parallels with this. The overshadowing beings were beginning to bring beings that were more, let's say, fleshly, harmonious, and balanced than the half creatures that we saw earlier. And yet they hadn't refined the spiritual nature, the love nature. In part, it was the refinement of the animal forms, the gorilla, as Cayce said, or the ape man, into a more spiritual basis. But gradually this process went on. Lemuria lasted perhaps 1 million years. And from the time of the low point to its final destruction within the Atlantis cycle, it was probably another 500,000 years. When I saw this, it was a painting on the back of a science fiction cover of a magazine of many years ago and later reprinted. It just seemed to represent Lemurian so much. The mists, the fogs, and very water logged in many respects. And I sometimes think when you see the young kids with these small truck chassis mounted on these enormous tires, I automatically think, my gosh, they're riding over the bogs of Lemuria, you know, and had a good time doing it, obviously, so they're unconsciously recreating this. Here's one of my favorite pictures because I think it represents the past life of a dear friend of mine, but it also represents the idea that cultures that we actually have some knowledge of in terms of artifacts, as in Egypt, and this is obviously of Egypt, also had parallels in some of these cycles. You could find something similar perhaps in one of the eras of Mu or the later Lemurian time, and you would find similarities to Atlantis. And all of these past cultures in turn were reflected subsequently in the cultures we do know about, whether it's Greece or Egypt or Babylonia or Rome or what have you. Now here, this is a figure you don't need any explanation for. It's, I think, one of the very best pictures of Edgar Cayce that was ever taken in his lifetime. And it shows something of the inner wisdom of this great soul. And I think for anyone that's seriously interested in getting metaphysical bases and principles that are enduring and universal, you could go much further and not find what you find in the Cayce readings. How it's interpreted in some cases, that's the individual. That's why I always suggest go to the original Cayce readings. Read those files. Find out for yourself what Cayce said. And if you're looking over a difficult subject such as Atlantis or so, then be prepared to spend 10 or 20 years meditating and wondering and looking around, and insights come. Among my circle of acquaintances, I'm often known as an Atlantean monomaniac. It isn't that I was set out to do that, I can assure you, but by sheer interest in the subject, you're constantly seeing parallels in everyday life. It's, my God, that's straight out of Poseidia. Or I'm sure there's a parallel to Og here. And it's an unconscious thing. If you have a really good friend, he'll or she will let you kind of share these things out loud. Otherwise, you kind of go through life quietly cataloging these things. And once in a while, if you're very fortunate, you meet a friend who's also quite a good mystic and psychic and can sometimes verify these things in the Akashi. Now here's a rather dramatic scene that illustrates something of the enormity of the earth changes that come to pass when each of the great cycles ends in the earth's plane. I use this one to illustrate the breakup of the Lemurian or the Mu continent into the lesser islands. Now these don't happen by chance, and it certainly isn't God whimsically saying, "Oh, I'm getting a little bit bored, let's stir things up." It has a direct correlation to man and woman in the earth and their action and interaction among themselves and the elemental forces. Why is this so? Because they resonate to the desire and the negativity that they, as part of the spiritual beings that helped create the planet, set in motion. We are not here by chance. I know many people sincerely believe that we're the seeds of outer space astronauts and that sort of thing, and we're not really here, but the Cayce readings suggest we're exactly in the realm that we helped to create when we were much different, much larger in consciousness, but perhaps not as wise spiritually as we're growing to be in the present. But there are links. Cycles come not altogether bad either, even the most catastrophic, because very simply, as we all know, man lives eternally in the earth. There is no death. This shows you, of course, the shifting of the earth on its axis. I'll go back to that just a little bit. You see, I discovered the secret. This is sort of a little montage I put together because Cayce was one of those psychics that steadfastly maintains that the earth does shift on its axis periodically, and brings, of course, great disasters in its wake. But aside from, again, the loss of life and cultures and this, with the eternality of the soul, there is a rebirth, new cycles, lands come up that were under the sea, and old, worn out, tarnished, perhaps evilly impregnated lands go back to be cleansed under the sea. And it's an ongoing process. Even the concepts of California possibly being broken up. It is a karmic condition and karmic prophecies, and with our invested interest in love of California, it's not something we want to see. But remember, we're still children of destiny, and there are cycles within cycles. Someday, if Cayce is right, that must come to pass, but out of it will come a new world order. And that was the case with this emergence of Lemuria, probably about 210,000 BC. Then you had a new dawning of consciousness. In fact, many of the souls that had been these celestial beings imprisoned in matter were finally released because they had tried in the last new cycle to bring enlightenment to many of their projections. And now you had an opportunity for a new cycle, and that's, of course, the land of the wave, Atlantis. It was a great continent, according to Cayce, and there was a sense of harmony and beauty and purpose in this creation that was not evident in the cycles before. Cayce speaks of the androgynous nature of these spiritual beings, the unity of the dual aspects, and the idea that there was, now they could create a land where the life forms could begin to work their way back to the Father, Mother, God. And this working their way back does not just include physical man, physical woman. It includes the animals. It includes all life, and it goes further than that. It includes the imprisoned consciousness that is found in matter, whether you want to call it stone or wood. But the earth itself is an unnatural condition cosmically. Just as it had a beginning in creation, so it must ultimately have an ending as the consciousness is liberated and returns to the spiritual realms. But it's our schoolroom, and we're working away at the best of our level, even if we're a grand villain in Lemuria or a dedicated teacher of enlightenment. And the interesting thing to be found in the Cayce readings is that the old soul is the extremist. Some of you probably have met people in metaphysics that will tell you, well, I've always been the good guy or the good girl in Atlantis. So-and-so was obviously a son of Belial or a daughter of Belial if there ever was. And I had all kinds of trouble with them. But the truth is, all of us have been both. And that's how the soul learns. You make a lot of karma when you're in a high place, and you can make people jump. And then when you're on the other end, you cry out, oh, why is this happening to me? And yet they do not want to look into the record, or they're not yet able to. But it's a learning process. The Atlantis cycle at its beginning, the magic age, if you will, was an age of light, of spiritual joy, of imaginative pictures that they could once again tune in from the higher realms. Once again, their memories of the spiritual realms have been awakened. Here we see again another picture of Edgar Cayce, this outstanding seer of seers, the father of the holistic concepts that we're now really beginning to seriously investigate. But much more so, he brought a philosophical meaning and purpose to why we are in the earth. You could spend many hours talking of just some of his outstanding past lives, from Atlantis to Egypt and even in the present. But this is, again, the person and the body of work that I would most recommend to any of you that might be interested in studying this. Now, in 1932, Edgar Cayce began a series of readings on Atlantis. He had been asked to give a talk on Atlantis, and he sort of scratched his head a little bit and said, Gladys, I don't know anything about Atlantis. Well, Edgar, you've been talking about Atlantis and some of the life readings that you've given people. In 1923, you talked about me being in Poseidia. And Cayce says, yeah, but the problem is I don't remember any of this when I wake up. So I said, all right, I'm going to do several readings just on Atlantis, so I'll be able to talk about it as if I knew something about it consciously. And the very first reading, he spoke, he posed a rhetorical question. Was Atlantis for real? Did it exist? Was it much as our writer, Dweller on Two Planets, described it, or that of the theosophical source? And then he went on to answer the question by saying the record of Atlantis is in the rocks. And that in itself is a rather teasing statement, because it's answerable on several levels. You can find the literal hieroglyphs, which is what I'm showing you here. Actually, these are known locally as Lemurian rock carvings. They can be found down near Escondido on a high hill, and they were quite sacred to the Indians, but several psychics feel they're much older than the American Indians of the historical era. But I liked it because you can obviously see the symbol of the sun and some of the glyphs that do suggest Atlantis. But you also can find in the record of the rocks some of the intriguing mysteries around the world, such as the Bimini Road that generated such controversy in the early 1970s. And I don't know if it ever was satisfactorily resolved, except to my eye as a layman, that certainly doesn't look like a natural rock formation to me. Cayce also went on to say that evidence of Atlantis would be found in the Bimini area. As a matter of fact, there would be more gold uncovered, Atlantean gold, that is in existence in the world today. Now, this reading was given probably in the mid-30s, something about that time. But that's another example of Atlantis in the rocks. But the real preservation of Atlantis, aside from the eternal dioramas or pictures in the Akashic record, are the inner knowings and subconscious memories that each of us have. We are walking data banks on Atlantis at different eras, different times. Some things where life was good in Atlantis, we can almost reach out and touch it. But others, they may be deeply buried and double, triple locked in the subconscious mind. But this again might represent this magic age of enlightenment coming into being, very ethereal, very much imbued with the spirit of beauty and light. And this now beginning already to move, for as Cayce described it, as the movement of the mind like unto gas, from the higher level, then the lower mental, and so on until it moved into physical form. In a sense, they were repeating the basic pattern of the very earlier cycles that had created civilizations in Lemuria and so on. But this time there was that attempt to bring light and beauty and a sense of wonder. And there was joy underlying their creativity. But as time went on, again, the links of karma began to subtly, and then not so subtly, alter some of their creations. And to the point where some of the Amelia's host, where they were all under the guidance of this great spiritual or avatar Atlantis. What is going wrong? We're trying now not to defy God, but make pathways of light or a kingdom wherein all those in matter can find their way back to God, and yet something isn't right. There's changes, and it became, of course, the eternal allegorical struggle between the positive and the negative. The negative is already imbued and locked into matter, as we've seen from their earliest creations. And so then it became a case of sometimes you win one, sometimes you don't win one, sometimes you join it. And but you're dealing again with flesh, with form, with feeling, with sensuality, sexuality. And so archetypes became expressed of this as much as the imagination could manifest itself. And as time went on and we moved into the pastoral age, these forms became more locked into matter. And the best intention sometimes took on a little bit of an unholy look. And yet, because the Father, Mother, God was seeing into the hearts of these manifestations and understanding the intent as a positive thing, there was help. They weren't all alone. They hadn't locked themselves off from God as in ages past. Now here we might have a little wood nymph, and much of the mythology we find in fairy tales actually has its basis in Atlantean times, and most particularly, I think, the Pastoral Age. But you have all these extremes, and in some cases, fascinating if revolting characters of fantasy. The satyrs, again, representing sensuality, sexuality unleashed, and creating in turn many manifestations and extremes. But you had now art being focused with archetypes, expressions, trying to define what they were and where they were, and how to find the purpose and meaning of life. And this is what all the civilizations that we know of, that we've been a part of over the ages, have tried to do in religious thought and secular thought and philosophy. I use this picture to sort of illustrate the very masculine aspect of what might be called the first age of man. Very, very angular, solid, massive. And of course we find its parallel in known history in the Mayan and Aztec cultures particularly. In the actual Atlantean it might have been much more beautiful as well. But you can see this angular, massive aspect. And this represented a long period of Atlantis. Atlanteans worshiped the sun god, and their spiritual side, seeing this as a symbol of the divinity of the spiritual force. And as it became debased through selfishness, why, less of the inner and more of the outer. George Powell created a rather interesting film, Lost Atlantis, which you can sometimes see on television. And it's interesting that one of the consultants on the film was Peter Baldish, and he was very active in ARE work during the 50s and early 60s. He later won an Academy Award as the montage director of An American in Paris. But he had his input, he and several other ARE members, in the George Powell production. So you see the misuse of the crystal, and you see some of the humanoids and things like this. Now, we're indebted to Cayce for some basic descriptions of what the Atlanteans were like physically. He said they were the red race. And perhaps the American Indian, particularly the Eastern American Indian, is most representative of the basic racial type. Now this, of course, is not an Eastern American Indian. This is a Peruvian mocha pot. And you can see, again, the red-skinned and much of the Indian look. And the interesting thing is, according to Cayce, you find Atlantis extending from the east coast down through Peru itself. So it was an enormous continent in its original state. Then, of course, as part of the conflict that began to arise in the Atlanteans during this first masculine age, if you will, was the conflict over the things. the humanoids, half human, and whether they should work or be slaves, or whether they should be encouraged to grow and to learn and to evolve. And this grew into a great schism between the sons of the Law of One and the sons of Belial. The Belial represents the materialism of every age, of every culture, of every time. Mean-spirited, indulgent, exploitive. The humanoids don't have souls. Why not use them for labor? Why not attempt to appease the gods? Whereas those attuned to the Law of One, they would go within. They could see the spirit, they could see the aura, and they could object. And at times, one of these powers was dominant, and other times, other cultures. And then they began to reap some of the karma that they had sown in the animal kingdom in other ages. The great overrunning beasts, for example, flying in from over the waters of partially submerged Lemuria. And then when you had lesser earth changes, beginning to be a bridge, literally, for some of the great saurians that then began to move into Atlantis itself and into other parts of the world, in Asia. Wherever there was any kind of a land bridge, the threat of the overrunning beasts became very, very real. My friend Jessica was kind enough to share many, many Akashic readings with me over the years, clearly saw that the great dinosaurs were contemporary with the Atlanteans, let's say 100 or 50,000 BC. They are not millions of years old and far removed from man and the earth. And this, of course, is precisely what Edgar Cayce said. So therefore, our emotional links to some of the horror films and the fantasy films that show this very connection are more linked to truth than our very wise PhDs that pontificate from the mental mind and quite devoid in many cases of the intuitive or soul knowing that the average housewife might have, or the small kid that's both appalled and enthralled. Now, one of the things the Atlanteans attempted to do was to destroy these great beasts as they became a real peril. Having mastered solar energy, they began to employ laser technology, probably for the most part on a much larger scale than this, but this was a montage I created just to kind of illustrate the premise. They had great crystals capable of radiating solar energy and power over vast, vast areas. And they were very successful at times in decimating many of the great beasts. But always there's a price to pay. There is, as the Chinese are very familiar with, the law of balance, or equipoise, or equilibrium. And it must come to pass. When anything gets too far out of balance, nature, God, the inner side of man moves to address this. And as conditions grew worse in the earth through materialism, through selfishness, through extremes of sensuality, and this lack of awareness of a love force within us, so the scales began to tip. And I like this picture because it does illustrate the concept of the scales. And the great face might represent the face of the avatar, Emilius, who could see this happening and could no longer reach his fellow companions. And yet, in the midst of this sorrow, seeing both great earth changes coming and the misery of man and the earth and the lesser kingdoms, there came a call of great light. We will help. We will help. Because Emilius suddenly knew he must not stand detached and as one of great wisdom, but an observer, but he must roll up his sleeves, so to speak, and get into the action. And this, in essence, was the beginning of the Adamic projection that Edgar Cayce spoke of, in which she, this great androgynous being, chose to separate into 5 twin soul couples in the earth. The red race in Atlantis, the yellow race in the Gobi land, the brown race in the Andes area around South America, the black race in the Nubian lands, the white race in the Caucasian lands. And this was done almost as of an instant, as it were. And I think one of the readings, I'm speaking personally now because you won't find it so described in the ARE, but I think part of the great wisdom Cayce brought in channeling the information on Atlantis is that he had been one of those 5 Adams, the white race, as my friend Jessica saw, and that Gladys Davis's secretary had been his Eve, or the feminine twin soul. And it marked the beginning of a new cycle in the earth, because this sacrifice of Emilius was made in the spirit of love, not desire, not an intellectual attempt to get things going and organized and precisely defined, but went in there naked, as it were, unafraid, unashamed, trying to heed the advice of the inner spirit and to become channels of birth and death for the new race of man, the race of true man in the earth. It was a remarkable thing because gradually, as time went on, these other races, half human, whether they were centaurs or mermaids or people of the wood and fen or hoof and horn, you would have a channel that was more refined of spirit and body together. And so you would have the beginning of true man as a love expression. And according to Cayce, this was the last creation of the Father, Mother, God. And this was recent. There's some question about how recent it was. But, however, Adam and Eve, still as human beings, as innocents as it were now, only 1/5 of the great consciousness of Emilius, began to make mistakes. They created as they had done in the past through the mind, and it took a while before they began to find that out of self, out of the love for one another and the sharing, would this new race come physically in the birth cycle. As we hear in the biblical story of the angel with the flaming sword, as Jessica saw it in the Akasha, it was the eruptions of great volcanoes, perhaps the shifting of the earth on its axis, that destroyed the Edens of the world and forced Adam and Eve to go out into the world, as it were, roll up their sleeves and begin the long struggle back to find their spiritual heritage. In a sense, they were the prodigal son and daughter. And remember, there were 5 of them, and they represented the archetype of the 5 races. And each, therefore, of the races that we see in the world today are spiritually equal. Racial prejudice has no place in the world, according to Cayce, because we're all equal. The task is to try to learn to live with one another and see this harmony rather than the disharmony. Now, this is one of the maps I did in the very early 70s. I tried to psychically douse, as it were, some of the continental land areas of Atlantis. This would represent the continent after it had been broken up into 5 great islands. If you look carefully in red, you will see parts of North America, and you'll see a little bit of Cuba and some of the other places, because the North Pole and the South Pole were in different positions than they are today. And this might represent the second age of Atlantis. Now we're going to see a whole new phenomena coming to pass. We're going to be seeing the beauty, after all the imbalance of the masculine and power and drive, and now we're going to see the rise of the feminine principle, the emphasis on beauty, on grace, on wonder, on light and life. And for a long, long time, this became a great cycle. The people developed genetically many of the things that we find in the world today. Oranges are one example. It's a purely Atlantean fruit. Watermelon pink, for example, and orange are very Atlantean colors. They're energy colors, both of them, aren't they? You had the rise of myths and legends, whereas we saw in Lemuria and in earlier Atlantis the real overrunning beasts, horrific and frightening, now somewhat removed from that time and place. They could be glossed over and romanticized, something like, well, what did Dad do during World War II? Well, 45 years later, hey, maybe it wasn't so bad, you know. And first thing you know, is we're talking about two entirely different wars, aren't we? But these had a reality not only in their consciousness, in romantic fairy tale and story, but remember, we're not limited on the inner planes and the inner dimensions. We can find these worlds and realms, and they're just as real as we want to have them. So this becomes an enduring and eternal thing. There was great knowledge expressed in this second age of beauty of the angelic kingdom and the part that the angelic beings played in the affairs of man and woman in the earth. The healing angels and the rose angels and all of the invisible hierarchy. This was taught in the temples. It was sought out. But as time went on, and of course we're capsuling many thousands of years in but a few frames, extremes began to manifest. There was a period when the masculine principle was dominated by the feminine principle, and this created, according to Jessica, as she saw it in the Akasha, some of the karma that women collectively chose to meet over the last 12,000 years. Because these cycles were long. We're used to short realms of history. America's, what, 200 years old? Europe's maybe 1,000 years old or so. And Egypt, well, maybe we can stick in 6,000 or 7,000. But this is nothing to a culture that existed 200,000 years in various cycles. So the handwriting was on the wall, and the shifting of the earth began to change things. But for a while they hung in there. As the balance of soul and wisdom tried to perpetuate the ideals of the law of one, you had that reflected in their culture. They loved the archetypes such as the harvest goddess of fertility and growth for all living things.
Is that Astarte?
Pardon?
Goddess on Astarte? Greek?
You could find later on that this was going back to this kind of consciousness. There was very much, many had the third eye very much existent. They could see clairvoyantly these great devas and elementals of land and sea. They didn't have any doubt about life after death or the interlinking of soul and spirit and the physical. Many could see. Their temples blossomed and bloomed. But the ages moved on. I like to use this as representative perhaps of the third age of Atlantis, Poseidia. And this is one of your Northern California artists' work, Joseph Parker. And in the 70s, if any of you remember your hippie days, why he was greatly beloved as a visualizer of unseen realms. Of course, just purely imagination. Couldn't have had a basis in reality, but you and I know different. And again, the temples taught the balance of love and sharing between the masculine and feminine principles. And the initiates learned and grew. And this knowledge was never lost in the mystery schools, whatever else happened. You had this revitalized at times because it is in the subconscious, it is in the Akashi. They knew how karmic patterns of destiny, astrological patterns, influenced an incoming soul into physical form. And even as the earth changes came, when they became overbalanced, the knowledge was not lost. They might lose their lives, their land might be torn and ripped asunder, but still they could return to this land, to this ideal. And in the third age, of course, you have the three great islands, Poseidia and Aaron, and Og. And now you see the pole has shifted. It's off of Hawaii now, and you can see a little bit more clearly where present-day Florida is there in the red outline, parts of Central America and even South America. And this again, another Johnny Parker painting, is I think very illustrative of this last age. This became a synthesis of both the masculine principle and the feminine principle. Now they were awakening the powers of the mind as never before. But there was a price to be paid. They were now also more enmeshed in flesh, less etheric, less spiritual, less psychic, if you will. The third eye had receded in many of the Atlanteans. And I'll share with you a brief story from one of Jessica's past lives when she was a Poseidian princess. I was doing a slide story one time on the ancient astronauts and their relationship to Atlantis. And in doing some of the Akashic research, Jessica discovered one of her past lives. Lynn was reminding me that not everyone knows Jessica. And it's too bad because you would have liked her, I'm sure. She was a very warm and open-hearted devotee of the Cayce readings. She gave virtually all of her adult life to lecturing. She was a born psychic and clairvoyant, and I know some of you here have received a life reading or two from her, so I don't think I have to stand here alone and say she was as brilliant as Edgar Cayce in the realm of life readings on many occasions. She didn't specialize in the health readings or the medical readings. Her interest was in karma and reincarnation and life after death. But she was very warm, and over the years from about 1960 until shortly before her death in 1986, she hosted weekly meetings down in Los Angeles under the Parapsychology Forum and the Philosophical Roundtable and a number of conferences up at Asilomar. And as I might mention for those that are interested, we'll be having a PRT conference over Memorial Day this coming 1991. But anyway, it was a great pleasure for me to work with Jessica over the years. And after I'd get through mimeographing her books in the evening, why sometimes we'd sit down and talk, and she would share some of her psychic insights. And so I thought, well, it's very illustrative of the Atlantis cycle, or the end of the Atlantis cycle, to create a little bit of a picture vignette of an authentic, true story of Atlantis. It may seem far out to you, but I assure you, to the best of my knowledge, this was true. And it was as Jessica saw. Naturally, I had to pick out the symbology to illustrate it. But as Jessica saw it, she was a young Poseidian princess. She was the daughter of a noble in a high place. And so, as was the case, she had some privileges. One of the things she most enjoyed was the shoe ships. They were little portable flying craft, one person, that were powered by solar energy. They were very light, very maneuverable, and very safe. And so she used to like to challenge some of the other boys, some of them older. And it was great sport. She just loved this. And this was at a time when Atlantean technology was very material on one level, but you could actually say it was super science. There was an interest in life on other worlds and other planets. However, most Atlanteans, those spiritually evolved, felt no need to go to other worlds because they could project themselves out of the body. They could go to the moon or Jupiter or wherever and see for themselves. But yet there were a few that decided to master the laws of physics and the principles involved to actually physically visit. And I remember in one reading, Jessica described one Atlantean scientist that did this and left a small triangular golden pyramid on the moon as proof of his journey. Now, whether this relates in any way to the UFO stories and such, I can't see. But I have often thought, well, when I leave the body this time, I'm going to take a peek myself and see if that golden pyramid is there. You know, there's so many things, if you're interested in fields of study like this, whether it's crystal healing or runes, why, we've got marvelous opportunities on the other side. I'm able to tell you, even if you're not too psychic in the present, be able to do this research. And you'll find it's an open-ended research. The picture just gets bigger. I will remember years ago, and this is back in the early 60s when Jessica first began to read for me, I said, well, I'd like to study Cayce's story of Atlantis. It'll be like Greece. Maybe I can write a small book on it. And I had it all visualized that I could neatly put it in a square frame in a box, and it had its beginnings and its endings. But in reality, it isn't. We are Atlanteans here, in a sense. The Atlantean story is still continuing on, as I said in the beginning. It's another phase. We're not calling it Atlantis now, but what might some of our generations to come? They may see the link that we're not able to see yet. And I dare say when we leave the body, we will see a lot more karmic and physical links than as yet we can imagine. Anyway, this was all really a part of the Poseidian princess's story, but she determined to take part in a great air meet that was held in a rather distant land. Remember, Atlantis had been broken up into 5 islands, so there was a lot of water where once there was land. And in reality, this air show was held in the area we call the Nazca Lines. So it was a pretty good journey, but again, these small aerial craft were quite safe. So Jessica, I remember telling me very vividly, she saw herself leaving one evening and flying over the city. And at that time, of course, the moon had its own companion, as we find in the Cayce readings. So it was a full moon night, you'd have 2 moons. So obviously it was great for the romantic. You can imagine them walking along those beautiful terraced buildings under a soft breeze, because Atlantis, of course, had the balmiest of breezes and the most delightful places to be. But I rather imagine that most of these symbols, as Jessica saw it, actually represent Atlantean symbols that have simply survived in the 12,000 years since the fall of Atlantis, simply because of the dry climate and the relatively undisturbed areas until recent times when sand buggies and helicopters and such can ferry visitors, and roads are being cut through these artifacts. But I think you are looking on authentic Atlantean designs. They may represent symbols of Atlantean localities. There may have been competitions as to how they could be created, and so on. But this was the site the princess was heading for. And she flew over some rough terrain because they still had some of the great beasts of the sea that had not been vanquished by the Atlanteans. And she went forth very steadfastly. And about when she reached the coast of South America, I guess she came around in a long circle and approached from the western circle, or western area. She saw rising up a large dinosaur, a Tyrannosaurus Rex. She was very specific about this. And so she wheeled her craft and tried to fly away, and in doing so, she disturbed some nesting pterodactyls. And perhaps this was an especially feisty mother pterodactyl, but she was ticked off. And she immediately started flying after the small shoe ship. And this was a pretty scary thing for the princess. because subconsciously she had once before been killed by one of the great beasts. So she flew as fast as she could toward the Nazca site because she was practically right on top of it. And here again is an illustration of perhaps some of the other craft that might have been participating in this. But when she reached the site, the pterodactyl slammed into the side of the shoe ship, disabling it to the point that the craft began to spiral straight down. And I remember Jessica saying very clearly, "Jerry, I was out of my body watching the whole thing long before the craft hit the ground." And I was so furious at that pterodactyl. I was just enraged. I had wanted to win that race and get the approbation from my father, and I was mentally calculating, well, I've got to get back to comfort my body. I've got to encourage my father and the queen to make love so that I can be conceived, come back, and let's see, 10, 15, 16 years, I can get into the competition. She said all this raced through her mind, and even before the shoe ship crashed into the ground. I never knew whether she followed through, but that was a true Atlantean story. Now here again, as we come to the close of our story, or draw near to it, this is a scene from the George Powell film, Lost Atlantis, where you begin to see the rise of materialism, the mean-spiritedness that we see and have seen in America in recent years by some reborn Atlantean extremists. The godlessness, in the most literal sense, little concern or compassion for those less fashionable, and a driving need to worship mammon or money and power. And again, the law of imbalance was growing in that land. You had also the equivalent of vivisection on a human scale, or humanoid scale, as many of these things or slaves of the Atlanteans were called. And then you had the human dramas on different levels. You had lovers that perhaps were not so in love with one another. Perhaps there was the interest in inheritance, and perhaps a rich estate to be aspired to. So there might be honeyed words and more than a little karma made, you see. And these things had a way of happening as this last age began to draw toward its twilight climax. And of course, for those that held true to the law of one, there was knowledge on the inner planes, in their meditations, and in the hall of spiritual mirrors and light, and they could see what was coming. And many of them began an evacuation, just as at different ages before the great cataclysms. And then, of course, the materialists felt they were very triumphant, as you can imagine. They had achieved all of the power and might, and what matter a soul that he gain the whole world, or gain all of his kingdom and loses his spiritual heritage, so to speak. And so there came a day when those reclining in great luxury looked into their view screens and saw a great cataclysm and an ending to a 200,000-year epic story. But of course, there isn't really an ending to the story because of reincarnation. They had to come back in the body, and because many were not generous of spirit in sharing technology with other lands and places, why, when they reincarnated, why, many of them met this kind of karma. They had shared in Asia or in Egypt or in the Americas. Life might have been much better. But the legend endures. It's one that doesn't quite go away. I was talking to a gentleman earlier this evening that recalled while he was in high school, he became fascinated with the Atlantis story and legend. And in those days, there weren't nearly the amount of information available as there is today. But it's one of these things that just refuses to go away. It just has a reality that is of the heart and soul and spirit. This is, of course, the National Geographic map showing you if you have eyes to see where the original Atlantean continent existed, in part. Now, it actually stretched across the continent, but you can see where the great cracks in the central spine of the mountains helped to break up this land almost as though you would break up a puzzle. Not all at once, but piecemeal. And it's also the reason that parts of Atlantis will rise again as parts of California and Americas and other places go down and go up again as new cycles emerge. Here's a picture that shows why I think California and the earth changes are much closer to us than we realize, because the East Pacific rise actually flows right up the central portion to lower Baja. And you can see this could be a natural extension in much the same way as the mid-Atlantic ridge express what was once mountainous land of Atlantis. But these great fracture zones actually extend under the continent. Modern geologists are fervently convinced that they stop at the edge of the continental plate, and that the land that is continents has always been land, and the sea bottom has always been sea bottom. Tain't so, according to the Cayce readings. I don't mean to sound like a prophet of doom, because as any of my friends would tell you, I love California. I've been transplanted here from New Jersey many, many moons, and there is no comparison to New Jersey. I want you to know I love this dearly. But I take Edgar Cayce very seriously as a result of my friends' explorations of Atlantis and the Akasha and my own studies. I think he was the greatest prophet of our age, and I'm afraid that he's talking about changes to come. Whoops, we got that one upside down. But if you'll stand on your heads, why, you'll see Edgar Cayce, and actually it's a montage of a scene from Universal's film Earthquake that kind of describes a little bit the concept of the coming earth changes. And here's a newspaper of the future, hopefully maybe long after our time, but if you ever hear of Mount Vesuvius erupting violently and Mount Pelée erupting violently, Edgar Cayce had said that is the warning. There will be 90 days before the great quake and inundation of California. And then I thought, well, I'll try to visualize in my own mind a little bit of what might come to pass. Now, this slide was prepared some years ago. It looks a little bit, it's the Malibu area. And I have to tell you, it's a little bit more built up than it was then. But I think this might give you a little idea. When we talk about magnitude, we hear about the big quake, but geologists really don't know what they're talking about when we're talking big quake, if we look at it in terms of the Atlantean experience. This isn't an 8-pointer, as you can readily see. And one of the things that was a little bit disturbing to me was driving with my friend Jessica one day downtown, and it was at night, and all of a sudden she gasped in sheer horror and got very still. I didn't know what was going on, but I was driving, so I just had to wait it out. And she said, "Jerry, I just saw the most horrible thing. I saw the waters pouring in on the city and flowing up around that downtown new office building." Now, there weren't all of the other buildings at the time. I think the Arco Towers was one of the tallest. But she said, "I saw it so clearly. Oh, it was so frightening." Now, again, let's hope this doesn't come to pass. This is the Griffith Observatory, and the picture is designed to symbolize perhaps the inundation of the Los Angeles basin, because Cayce spoke of the inundation extending as far as Salt Lake City. But the main thing when Cayce talked about the earth changes, he tried to stress, sound this as a loving warning, not as just a prophet of doom trying to scare everybody. And in that sense, you're sort of between a rock and a hard place if you even say anything about it, let alone show a picture of it. But it's been an area of study of mine, and maybe it's a little bit of karma, because I was one of those sons of Belial that helped contribute to one of the great cataclysms. So ever since I've known Jessica and the Cayce Prophecies, it's been a little bit like a sword of Damocles. I could take it more seriously than anybody else because subconsciously I knew it had happened. But the real meaning of these stories is that we are spiritual children of the Father, Mother God, and the great being of light and love, and the eternality of all life. Thank you very much.
A gigantic green crystal in the Santa Cruz Mountains and a sister one in near Kauai or Maui. And I was just wondering if you've heard anything about that.
I've heard a number of fascinating stories. There's, I think, a gentleman in Los Gatos. I can't think of his name now. He lectured for us recently, and he's been exploring some of these sites. And I don't know. I was kind of spoiled, I guess, having my friend Jessica, and I could go to her and say, well, what do you see in the Akashi? And I have to tell you, she was not much interested in science fiction or fantasy. She didn't go to any of those movies. She was a classic Piscean. She was interested in people and their situation. But I kind of struck a spark because she obviously had been a strong Atlantean. And when she would move into an altered state of consciousness, if she wasn't tired or weary, why, all of a sudden something might click. She had to become emotionally involved to give a reading that was worth a hoot, I'm here to tell you. If you were being dry and mental, it was yawn time for Jessica because she was feelings and emotions. And she said sometimes you gotta be angry to really get a good reading. Some of the Earth Changes material which I was showing you tonight. In 1967, she began to put out the third of her trilogy of Earth World Prophecies. And she was running late, being a Piscean, she didn't always meet deadlines too great, you know. But I went ahead as the artist and had the cover printed up separately with a headline about Joe Brandt's dream of coming Earth Changes. And the book was all ready to go. We had all the stencils done, but we didn't have anything on the Earth Changes. So I came over this evening and I said, Jessica, you got to do something on this Earth Changes. Oh, I can't. It's too late. I'm tired, Jerry. Just go down and run it. We'll mail it off so these people will get off my back. And I said, Jessica, damn it, I don't care if it's one paragraph. We've got to have something on the Earth Changes. And she said, oh, all right. If you insist, I'll give you half a page and that's it, and I'll bring it down. So I went on down there, turning the mimeograph and cranking out the rest of the book, you know. And not knowing what was going to come to pass, and hours went by, you know. I kept waiting her any time. And then finally I heard her tapping, and I came upstairs, and she was both excited, exhilarated, and a little bit horrified. But she had this huge sheet of stencils. She wrote right to the stencil because we had no time to do anything but get them off. And she said, I'm so glad you insisted that I do this thing because I got out my friend Joe Brandt's old dream of the Earth Changes, and as I was typing up the notes, all of a sudden my third eye opened and I started to see exactly what he'd seen in his dream and vision. And she said, it was very frightening, but I could see it. And so, of course, the resulting experience, she wrote it down, had this vivid immediacy of an eyewitness, you see. And so it became a highlight of the book, and probably what made World Prophecy 3 a classic. But you see, it was because her passions became involved. She got disturbed despite herself. And I'm not saying that's always the way to have a psychic experience or do that, but feelings are the gateway to unfolding insights. The academic approach is fine and great if you're just an engineer and you're very content with the practical, or if you have a job that demands that you be down to earth. You wouldn't want an airline pilot that's light and flighty. You want him to go watching those gauges. But when you start studying the psychic stuff in the world of the Akasha, you do need to become sensitive to your feelings and sometimes go with it even if you're not sure. And that's why dreams are great, as Lynn would tell you, because you have feelings in dreams, don't you? You see, you feel. Sometimes you yell, or you fly, or you fall, or you worry. But you do something, and it's the emotional body that is part of the great educating force for man and the earth as we try to unfold understanding. And we have to do it on our own terms, don't we? Tom's understanding may not be right for you or for you, but if you come to Tom and say, well, now, what do you think about that? If he's excited about it, he'll share it with you. And sometimes we have points of great agreement. And a psychic will say, well, I see that you two have been together in the past. You may not have been friends then, but there is a sharing on different levels. And of course, that gets back to Cayce. That's why his work was so great so far as I'm concerned. He stands by himself because he could see the karmic patterns. He could see how sometimes your worst enemy is in your own family. But the idea is to come back and to try to work it out instead of still going to loggerheads. It also explains strange and bizarre triangles sometimes. A son that hates his mother with a passion. He doesn't know why. The mother's a good mother. She's trying her doggonedest. But if you look in the Akashi, you see a lifetime or two ago, he was a wife. Or he was a husband and she was a wife. They just didn't hit it off. A little unfinished karma there in the subconscious mind. And vice versa. All of these things that if you start to study reincarnation and karma, and then when you start getting interested in earth changes, technological advances, possible war on the horizons, depressions, whatever it is, you'll find we're just not sitting in the middle of a vacuum, and how come this is happening? It all grows out of something that came before. And that was the wonderful thing about Cayce, because you can also apply this in healing. You don't have a diseased condition just out of the blue. You carefully work and build on it, maybe for half a lifetime. Or sometimes it is karma. You fall out of a carriage and you have a slipped disc, and certain grip germs happen to lodge there just because you were in that place and that time on that particular day. And if you got some good karma because maybe you were a healer or did something else at another time, well, somebody like Edgar Cayce comes along within 3 months, diagnoses it psychically, and you get the right treatment. If you don't, it's still not by chance. It's something the soul has chosen to work through. And we all know these things. But Cayce was so wonderful about bringing it to life. I know some people feel, well, the Cayce readings are rather dry, and there's some new faces and teachings on the horizon. But I guarantee if you take your time on whatever subject that interests you, and you use it in conjunction with meditation and dreams, you'll discover that there's so much more that Cayce didn't say. He might have seen it, but it's hard sometimes to put these in words. Now, somebody else had a question on Atlantis.
Last year I was privileged to go to the Azores. And on the island of San Miguel, they tell it to be a tip of Atlantis. And it definitely is a magical land.
Is it really? You could notice the vibration.
Oh, absolutely. There were 2 volcanoes on the island. At the base of one volcano, there were 2 springs that came out of the volcano that were about 5 feet from each other. One was opaque gold, and the other was a shimmery silver. And they had made a pond out of the golden water, and it was curing things like arthritis and other diseases. And but they were natural springs, and they were just that close to one another.
So you're kind of wondering, was it really part of Atlantis?
Well, have you ever heard of this?
I hadn't heard of the springs, but you know, in the history of that whole region, the Canaries particular, but the Azores are not far from them. They're in the Atlantic Ocean, closer to Europe, but they would definitely have been a part of the Atlantean continent, and probably existed until the last ages, maybe a part of Aran, I suspect. And there was a race of Indians, and they had a very special culture. I'm a little vague on the pronunciation of their names, the Gaunchis or something like that. They were exterminated by the Spaniards, I think, in the 17th century. But they had some curious traditions and some unusual carvings that made many people think, well, these might have been some of the last remnants of a now debased group of survivors of Atlantis. And very definitely, I would say you're tuning into vibes that were very real. And it's why we can go to different parts of the world and we'll tune in, sometimes positively and not so positively. Yes, ma'am.
Do you have any information that correlates to the Madrid fault, which is in the central part of the United States? There's so much talk about the rim around the Pacific, but that very active fault there that has had the worst earthquake
In
in the United
1841
States.
or 43, something like that, it was quite severe.
And
You might have heard about the Browning prophecy. I think he said that he feels there'll be quite a terrible quake in that area, in perhaps in early December.
Yes, and so does some of the other spiritual communities. And so I just wondered if any of the information that you have from the Cayce might have an indication, because it's really right in the center of the United States.
Well, Joe Haddix was mentioning the same thing earlier today, and it made me remember that in one of the Cayce prophecies on coming Earth changes, that he saw the Great Lakes would flow into the Gulf of Mexico.
Okay.
Now, I'm a little vague as to what direction the New Madrid Fault runs. Is it north-south?
Yes.
We'll see that. But you see, if Cayce's right, and land and sea areas do exchange elevations over the time, you probably have many subterranean faults, for example, that you can't see geologically at the surface. Some of them are very clearly visible and the scientists can map them. But it's the ones that you don't see, you know, it's that punch that comes out of left field that can sometimes do us in. I remember, many of you familiar with Cayce may remember the story that in the very early 20s, Cayce went to Texas in that area to get involved in the gold explorations, hoping to get enough money to establish his own hospital to treat people and do diagnostic readings. And he did a number of readings that seemed to verify, at least to the skeptical Texans, and believe me, they weren't the strongest supporters of psychic phenomena.
Never are.
And but it's very interesting that he gave several readings on the type of soil that they would find as they drilled down, and you know, they pull up a core.
You said gold, but you meant oil.
Oil, yes, I'm sorry, I meant oil. Well, black gold. And so it's interesting, they have preserved at Virginia Beach several of these readings. And he was remarkable in his accuracy. In some cases, they didn't find the oil, but invariably it was a time when the people involved were squabbling over who has the rights and this, that, and the other thing. But I remember one of these oil readings, it mentioned, just again very casually, now at 2,800 feet, you'll find this sand strata. And this sand strata just happened to be laid down 28,000 years ago at the time of the second inundation of Atlantis. I'm spelling it out just a little bit more than he actually said. He may have said just at the time of the second inundation, but elsewhere he had given the specific date. Now this was 3,000 feet in the ground. It was only 28,000 years ago. So I mention it only to show you how land masses activated by great eruptions and great tidal waves can so drastically affect the land that you wouldn't know there was a great culture 50,000 or 25,000 years ago. As a matter of fact, in the early days of geology during the 19th century, one of the predominant characteristics over much of Britain in the subsoil and substrata, they could almost always, any place they wanted to drill, they could find what they called this layer of old red sandstone. Now that didn't mean anything more to them than this was a very common, obviously a large extent that had reddish soil. But if you're a student of Atlantis and you look at the proximity of England to this great Pacific or Atlantic continent, and you know that Cayce stressed that part of the reason that each of the races developed genetically their skin coloring, it reflected the environments they lived in. And Atlantis was the red land, and they were the red-skinned people. So you see, there's evidence to be found, again, in the rocks, as well as in the Akashic record, if you know what you're looking for. Now, obviously, none of the geologists did, but it kind of jumps out at it if you have this knowledge. I see a question way back, sir.
Yeah, I've been studying Atlantis for about 20 years myself, and one thing that I've come to realize with a lot of archaeologists and also geologists is it's not so much a direct disagreement with Cayce now, it's a time difference. A lot of things that Cayce has said, my brother's a professor at the University of Illinois, and he knows a geologist quite well who's read a lot of Cayce stuff, and he says, it's just a matter of timing. His timing is way too early, but a lot of it is really right on what's come in the last 20 years, especially with the drifting of the continents that came in the mid-60s is something that was, from the 1920s or so, I think his name was.
Yeah, I think there was a fellow named Wagner that was
Wagner,
the pioneer of the drifting continent hypothesis. I think he got this concept from simply looking at a globe of the world, and with a little imagination you can see how the east coast of North America very readily seems to fit into Europe. However, and I understand several geologists that are active in the ARE work sort of subscribe to this. I must tell you I don't. I'm a student of cataclysmic geology, and I think that's what was found in the Cayce reading. There's no room for Atlantis or the vast Pacific continent if it just spread across like this. You have to have something in the middle, see, and that's one of the things that Cayce stresses, is the land that comes up and the land that comes down. And that, I think, is one of the big things that perhaps the geologists might debate, because the spreading seafloor and plate tectonics is the current geological theory.
According to my brother, that's starting to change.
Is it really?
Yeah, they're starting to see that there could have been some cataclysm in certain areas. It's just not out in the public too much. There was an article, I believe, in the Scientific American, 1989 July, that opens up some of this, that it may be possible that there was some cataclysmic happenings in maybe 200,000 years ago. See, the timelines still don't quite hit Cayce, but it's becoming more that way, slowly.
That's very interesting.
Yeah.
Some of you may be familiar with Velikovsky's work in the early 1950s. There was a maverick scientific researcher that was a very strong believer of cataclysms as the basis for creating the extinction of plants and animals and even kingdoms, that it was contemporary with some of the great legendary lands and so on. And one book, Earth in Upheaval, I recommend to you if you're interested in the subject, because he said, I won't use myth or legend for this book. I'll just go to the field geologists and their reports on what they found climbing the mountains and what fossils were found where. And it is quite a compelling look. And that seemed to me to support the Cayce premise, perhaps better than any other single book. And if you should be interested in it, I recommend it. Now, this lady had a question.
I was going to say that I've seen some things on the educational television that is saying what you're talking about, that they really are finding everything to substantiate the cataclysmic happenings.
View of geology.
In Florida, I don't know if you're aware of the discovery from 1976 that they're still working on, that is down in one of the springs 100 feet below the surface. And they've discovered there where that land used to be dry, it has a cave there, and they've discovered the oldest remnants of human bones down there, which is showing that that land was above ground, sea level, which that is right at sea level right now.
Oh, I see. So there had to be drastic movement in a relatively recent time, geologically speaking.
Yes. Also, there's just so much of this on television now, what the scientific evidences are. And Childress's books, Lost Ancient Cities of Lemuria, he's done them of the Pacific, of all over, where he has investigated and gotten the artifacts that does the proving of the geological shifts. And then there's other work about the DNA that traces the human race back to the 5 tribes that you talk about, and then again traces it back to one woman's DNA. I don't know if you've heard about that.
I've seen some of that, yes, yeah. Some of it is...
But they're really bringing it
what
out.
you're saying is there are some parallels now that are coming
To confirm
light,
it.
both very scientifically now, that are beginning to support Cayce.
Yes.
And that's the bottom line. Not that I want Cayce to be right if he's wrong. We're all interested in knowing what really happened. But we all have these compelling interests sometimes that arise at peculiar times, and we wonder, where did this come from? And it's got to be more than just genes and chromosomes.
I mentioned that tape, and that was really teasing me, because as a young kid, I saw the very end of that, and intuitively I knew that part of that was very true. And you mentioned the tape today, Lost Atlantis, and George Powell.
George Powell.
And I was like, where can I find? I've been looking ever since for that
I
video.
don't know if it's ever been released to video, but once in a while, late night, you'll see it on television. And I was fortunate to get a couple of stills from one of the Hollywood shops, that sell stills, and they were color shots, so they make a wonderful illustration, because there is a Cayce link there. Peter Balbish and, Jessica knew him at that time and probably told Peter what Cayce had said about Atlantis, but they did get some of the key elements in there. And I think it did stimulate the subconscious of a lot of people. Of course, Powell had to work on a very low budget, you see. So he had to borrow the great statue of Belial from, I think it was a Cecil B. Mills film, Samson and Delilah, and then do a little redecoration. But nonetheless, the whole thing came off quite well. And just to see the climax, they created a model of something of a Grecian city, and its inundation was quite well done. Very, very dramatic. Now, I saw, okay, Lynn has a question.
Where did how did the last, well, I have 2 questions. How were the 2nd and 3rd ages destroyed, and where did the records go at the end of the 3rd age?
Well, Cayce, as far as the 2nd age goes, that was the tuning in of the great crystals to too great an intensity. Now, exactly what was involved in this, what they were trying to achieve, I don't know. I suspect there was a commercial interest. It's just kind of a feeling that I had. Because they did have monetary systems and the whole thing. Although it was more of a feudal society or caste system than a democracy. You had the kings and the queens and the nobles. You had the merchants and the artisans, and you had the peasants, and you had the humanoids and the things. So again, what actually occurred and what the trigger was as far as the misuse of solar energy really was a reflection of the long ongoing imbalance that was created in the lands and the people and the culture. In other words, what I guess I'm trying to say is spiritually they knew the law and they lost sight of it. And of course this is the same thing in the Plato story. He of course describes the scrolls that Solon brought back from the Egyptian temple at Sais as Atlantis sinking in a day and night. Now it may even be that there were, I want to say, celestial inundations of sorts. I don't mean it quite that way, but there is a great meteorite field existing off the Carolinas, and Otto Muck, he was a German engineer that had worked on the V-2 rockets. And after the war, he just wanted to get as far away as the military as anything. And yet, he was one of these people with a meticulous engineering mind and consciousness. He he just couldn't let it go static. So I said, what interesting mystery can I research and explore? And he found the story of Atlantis to be fascinating. And for any of you that are students, you'll know that in Europe, from the time of World War I or after World War I through the 30s, Atlantis was a keen subject. Now, this not only in Germany, but in England and Italy. I've gone to the Library of Congress and looked some of the foreign titles, and it's amazing. You know, you've all heard, well, they had maybe 3,000 books on Atlantis. Well, they had that maybe in the 40s and the early 50s. They probably got 6,000 now with the literal inundation since. But Muck speculated that it was a giant meteorite that fell on the island of Poseidia and destroyed it.
In the second
May
age?
have, no, this would have been the last age. Perhaps, again, if the Earth was wobbling, as we heard a little earlier, why this tremendous force was enough to up-tilt it. And so the combination of the meteor and the tilting, which of course changed the Earth on its axis. In other words, if your Earth is rotating this way, you've got tremendous centrifugal force, but it's all in balance and it's all in harmony. But if you tip it and change this rotational thing even by 45 degrees, you can imagine what is happening on the surface. The oceans are spilling off the sea bottoms, and this is causing internal and external stresses. And then if there was a aerial-borne bombardment, you've got all kinds of planetary stresses. The interesting thing is, if you look at the ocean floor maps, and Lynn was kind enough to give me one that she picked up from Virginia Beach, and the Geographic has put out some of these, and we saw a couple tonight. You see these great fracture zones, these great stress zones. Not only are there the smaller ones, east and west, cutting these central ridges, but you also have these north-south fracture zones. They're really gigantic faults. And we're talking about not 100 miles or 1,000 miles or 5,000 miles. They literally girdle the Earth. They go into another fault zone or fracture zone that goes literally around the Earth. And you can imagine that if the Earth, in this process of formation, has expanded and contracted, and right now it's expanding, because we are returning to God. But in the time of spiritual involution, it was a series of continual contractions. The Earth was growing tighter and tighter around its spiritual core. But now, and I date it actually to the end of the Lemurian cycle, when this moment of truth came to the Lords of the Black Face that we saw. There began to be a realization of what they had done and why they were in the Earth, and an acceptance of their responsibility to bring things back. They could have sat on their duffs and said, well, let somebody else do it. But on the soul level, as with all of us, and the karmic patterns that we're working out individually and collectively, we know what the scoop is. The subconscious mind has all the information, as does the subconscious. And we reach that point where we say, hey, I see I've got something on the slate, long unfinished. I'm going to try to do something about it. And so in some cases, depending on the family or circumstances, they may be the great oddball. What the world? Why? Everybody else is getting drunk, and this guy wants to go to the monastery. What the heck is wrong with it? St. Francis of Assisi is a classic example of that. See? But that also represents an extreme. That's the thing that's great about the Cayce readings, is the fact that he talks about the old soul. We just get so pious as, oh my goodness, I've been good down through the ages, and this one's a villain and that one's not so good, and my mother in that life was rotten, but I've been a good innocent. But it ain't so, according to Cayce. And as we know from some of the books that have been published now that talk about Cayce's past life, why just a lifetime or so ago, he was the wastrel, gambler, Bainbridge. And yet, in Egypt, he was Ra-Ta with a vision that nobody else could quite match in the sheer scope and the dedication. He literally changed the world of his day down to the present day. We don't know this in world histories today, but one day we will. It won't be debated or it won't be ignored. We will see these landmarks. And each of you that have come here, it's because you've been temple teachers, you've done what I've done in the different temples, that you could resonate with a name like Atlantis or Lemuria or Lost Worlds, because you surely haven't been educated this in your schoolrooms by and large, although that's beginning to come now. You see, these insights come in. They have the answers. You're not going to reach them very easy. But the younger generation, they're a little more flexible. Their memories may be jogged a little bit more. And they say, oh, maybe there is another way of looking at this data, you know? And that's how these changes come. Yes, ma'am.
In this second stage, is that when the second moon was also?
I believe it lasted until the third age. As I remember Jessica's story, she definitely saw the second moon. Perhaps it was the second moon that might even have fallen on Atlantis. Exactly how or why, I don't know. There may even have been another moon before that in Lemuria. There are several English stories. Now, these are fictional, recreating the story of Atlantis. And there was a whole segment that believed that one of the moons broke up and fell on the earth. And one book in particular gives a very vivid description of the people trying to survive in the aftermath of this cataclysm. So this may well be a part of it.
And I wonder if she attached the name to that moon, because I've heard of setting up the lasers on that, and you know.
I wish I had thought to ask her that. The problem is, you know, when you're sitting before somebody with this wisdom, you think of 1,000 questions, but every question that is answered, there's really evokes many, many more, you know. And unless you follow through, and neither Jessica and I were that systematic, you know. She was a Piscean, and she'd often say, well, I feel like doing a reading for you tonight. Hey, great, you know, I grabbed the tape recorder and ready to run, but I didn't have anything pre-planned or anything like that, you see. So sometimes, and very often, we would use a Cayce Atlantis reading. We'd say, well, give me just a minute. This is after I'd give her a trance suggestion. Give me a minute, Maria Teresa. That was her guide. And I'd flip through some pages, hoping like hell she'd give me some guidance. Let me pick the right number to get her. Because if I didn't get her fairly soon, often she'd be very bored. It might be very dull. Sometimes it might start out bored, and I might ask a question that stimulated her, and she'd really be off on a rocket. It was kind of a yin-yang thing that worked out quite well, you know. But it wasn't systematically organized as an overall project, even though probably we were doing this on and off for nearly 20 years. But it was fun. Yes, sir.
I was just wondering if you had any comment on the recent developments with these crop circles that have been appearing in England, and also now I think they're starting to appear in the Midwest here in America.
Japan.
These geometric
I've seen it. I
formations
saw
that appear
some video.
overnight.
I think it was on hard copy and one of the others.
We have we taped on 2020 on
did you?
television. They did a story on it with Barbara Walters and the whole thing.
Oh, really?
And the guy went out there one night, the NBC crew or whatever, I forget which network it is, ABC, whatever. Anyway, they were out there one night because these circles appear overnight, and they were looking down this one field where they appear a lot, and they had their infrared cameras so they could see in the dark and all that stuff, and they were trying to find out how these things appeared. And lo and behold, the sun came up the next morning, and they turn around, and right behind them, on the ridge, they were on top of this ridge. Behind them, on the crop behind them, had appeared the most intricate form of geometric crop circles in history. Had appeared that very night that the television crews, the national network crew was there. And
Well, what was interesting, they probably said, well, now this is the most interesting field photographically and visually, so let's focus on this. We can get an excellent view. We won't bother with the one behind because maybe it isn't quite so photographically beautiful. But I remember seeing a tease on one of these hard copy that said, well, there was this camera crew that stayed on it and saw how the circles were formed, but I missed it. So I don't know what they saw. If anybody does know, that would be great. But it's
so
truly
they
a
look
mystery.
a lot like the Peruvian patterns.
Designs, and especially the newer ones where they actually have a line and then a couple of side things. It's absolutely a phenomenon that the military cannot dismiss so readily.
And they tried to prove
I
it with
wish I could
helicopters.
tell you what the meaning is.
But I was wondering if Edgar Cayce had said anything about in these times now that we'll be seeing the return of some higher intelligences or something.
There's only one reading that I know of, but very casually he mentioned that there would be some lights in the skies relating to other planets or something like that, but it was very loose and roundabout. And remember, he passed away in 1945, 2 years before Arnold saw the flying saucers around Mount Rainier and sort of coined it and brought it to everybody's consciousness, even though we know there have been sightings long before this. But I'm sure they would have been asking Cayce this, and I've asked Jessica this, I will tell you this, on several occasions, and I could never get a good answer from Maria Teresa or her. It was like something was either a little blocking her or she was uncertain. And I must tell you, she and her late husband had once seen the flying saucer when they were at a drive-in movie, so she didn't discount it. But as I mentioned in the talk, she wasn't particularly an advocate of beings from outer space seeding the Earth, because she looked at it from the Cayce perspective. And we were the ones that got involved in the Earth from the beginning. And it's a karmic thing. We have to clean up our act, and we have to go back. Now, because of the scope of this celestial creation, it may be that we have spiritual links to these other beings that we cannot imagine at this point. I mean, we're so fragmented, we're just now starting to awaken, in a sense. We're really in kindergarten. Although the PhDs will tell you, well, we're the big, brilliant, and the most smartest in the universe. Lexi, I think you have.
Yes, I was wondering, it's a two-question thing. The Hopi folklore and true understanding have said that this is the fourth cycle, and that the ant people will come from underground and take those that are ready to go, to create a better world underground when the cataclysm takes place. And two, are the Hopi Indians now dark-skinned because of the terrain, but weren't they part of the Lemurian people?
Yes, I personally think that they were primarily from the Pacific migrations, from Mu and Lemuria. And Cayce talks about some of the people of Mu moving across to that land, whereas the Eastern American Indian, the Iroquois, they are pretty much the pure Atlantean red race stock. And you will notice if you study pictures of the American Indians, the Western Indians are much more moon-faced, and the Eastern Indians are much more aquiline featured. So there is a difference. Of course, there was overlapping communication. And there was another migration relative to the American Indians, and it's touched upon in one of the Cayce booklets, The Great Migration, that some peoples came up from Central and South America. And again, there were Atlantean links, and Central America was also a little bit of a melting ground where people from the Pacific as well as from the Atlantic came, and those from South America. And there was around 3000 BC a migration of the lost tribe of Israel to Central America. I'm sorry, not to Central America, they came apparently to Southern California and gradually worked their way over to around the Tucson area in Arizona. And interestingly, karmically or synchronistically, about the same time there was quite a religious rebellion in the Yucatan area, which again, as you know from the Cayce readings, had been established 10,600 BC by the Atlanteans. But there was a great religious furor, and many Atlanteans broke away and started migrating northward through the Mexican peninsula. Now, most of the lost tribe that came across to Tucson were men. Most of the tribesmen breaking away and going north were women, and they met, as you might imagine, in this Tucson area. And there's the story of the lead crosses that talk a little bit about this. They've been found, and they are written in Hebraic, and they were branded as forgeries and all like that. But the evidence of the age of them indicates they're certainly authentic, so it's a verification of the Cayce readings. But the thing that's important, the point I'm trying to make, is this amalgamation. The women apparently told the tribe about the settlements in Mexico, the advanced civilization. And by this time, as you can imagine, the Hebraic tribe were wanderers and nomads in this strange land. So they resolved to go back to this homeland. And so they became the genesis of the Aztecs. That's quite fascinating in the Cayce, in view of the Cayce readings, because there's been so much discussion and wonderment. Was there such a thing? What happened to them? And what's the relationship? So they're not generally recognized by most archaeologists, but Willard was one that pointed this out, and he knew nothing about the Cayce story. This
My
lady
turn.
Was that strictly spiritual, or was talking about the consciousness of the civilization? So we don't have any more than that as a starting point. But and that was a long time ago.
Jerry, we're going to have to cut it, but I do have one question. I'm going to use my rule. Did Edgar Cayce or Jessica, either one of them, state when their soul would reincarnate again on this planet?
Cayce was pretty positive, and I think there's several books that mention he would be known as the Great Liberator. In 1998 is when he would come back in the body. Now, some people feel that's when he would be born. Some feel that that's when he would come to full maturity. I believe the former, based on the insights that Jessica got, that he will come into the body. She even had a few highlights of his next life when he would be a researcher related to something equivalent to the UN, but designed to eliminate the religious differences and schisms that divide them, and try to focus on philosophies and unifying principles that the world religions could agree on. And she even saw that he was going to meet some terrible karmic thing in that lifetime, which made me realize, you know, karma and our blueprints stretch a long way. But she saw, in the midst of doing this great work, he was about to be honored and literally world acclaim, and somebody else stepped in and took the credit, and there was nothing he could do about it. And Jessica said, I see it's absolute karma, and he knew this, but it was a crushing thing. But nonetheless, the work is accomplished, is what I guess I'm trying to say.
Yes.
What about her reincarnation?
Well, she saw her next life a similar time period, very close to that, and saw herself perhaps becoming a school teacher and also an actress. You know, Jessica had strong drama. Some of you may have seen some of her plays at Asilomar. Most of them are very short, but some of them are brilliantly done, and her masterpiece, I think, based on one of the books about the past lives of Jesus, was The Horizon of the Disk of the Sun, and it's the true story of Akhenaten and Nefertiti and all the palace intrigues, and of course Edgar Cayce was there as a high priest eye. And it's a brilliant piece of work. So there have been links that Jessica has had with Cayce over the ages, that sometimes the ARE at the present day hasn't quite got a focus on yet. She's sort of like an outcast. But I think as other people independently begin to research this, we will find out who are the real leaders. And one of the things I loved about Jessica, simply because I had a chance to be closely associated with her and her Akashic research, is that she worked for this spiritual ideal of Cayce and Rata over so many lives. And I'm not trying to say she was one of these pious goody-goodies. She made lots of mistakes, she had a fierce temper, and she committed suicide a few times. But there was something about the ideal, or the torch that the soul held up. That was so true of Cayce and many of those around him, and I dare say folks like yourself that are just drawn to an interest in a study in this kind of thing. Jessica would probably say, I dare say, Lynn would agree, that you've probably all been with me in the past, and she probably have a great feeling of companionship. And I shouldn't conclude without saying, well, Jessica was anything but than a fundamental Christian. She was a great student of Jesus and his past lives, and she agreed absolutely with the statement that Cayce gave in the philosophy, that the Master was the way shower for man in the earth. He was the original prodigal son. He was the first to find his spiritual heritage, but not as somebody floating on a cloud, but somebody very human. And his twin soul was, of course, Mary. That's why you could have an immaculate conception, because soul and spirit were so unified and so much as one. And so, if you're going to study the story of man and the earth, that's a part of it, I think Jessica would say. And we're just beginning to open the pages of the book. We're still at literally the beginning of studying the unknown history of the earth. And it won't all be written until each one of you research and write your part of it, and we put it all together. Then we have a library of Atlantis.
Thank you so much, Jerry.
You guys all have a very good
I have
evening.
that.